Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our reading of The Murder at the Vicarage. So far in our story, we've had the vicar confront Lawrence Redding about his confession, and then they go to see Mrs. Prothero, and of course, she confesses as well. So we're going to find out now what happens in Chapter 9. After leaving a message at the police station, the chief constable announced his intention of paying a visit to Miss Marple. "You'd better come with me, Vicar," he said. "I don't want to give a member of your flock hysterics. So lend the weight of your soothing presence." I smiled. For all her fragile appearance, Miss Marple is capable of holding her own with any policeman or chief constable in existence. "What's she like?" asked the colonel as we rang the bell. "Anything she says to be depended upon, or otherwise?" I considered this matter. "I think she's quite dependable," I said cautiously. "That is, insofar as she's talking about what she's actually seen. Beyond that, of course, when you get on to what she thinks, well, that's another matter. She has a powerful imagination and systematically thinks the worst of everyone." "The typical elderly spinster, in fact," said Melchett with a laugh. "Well, I ought to know that breed by now. Gad, the tea party's down here." We were admitted by a very diminutive maid and shown into a drawing room. "A bit crowded," said Colonel Melchett, looking round. "But plenty of good stuff here. A lady's room, eh, Clement?" I agreed, and at that moment the door opened and Miss Marple made her appearance. "Very sorry to bother you, Miss Marple," said the colonel when I had introduced him, putting on his bluff and military manner, which he had an idea was attractive to elderly ladies. "Gotta do my duty, you know." Of course," said Miss Marple. "I quite understand. Won't you sit down? And might I offer you a little glass of cherry brandy, my own making, a recipe of my grandmother's?" And you can see here, this is a little map of the village. And so they're right here at Miss Marple's house in the lane. And you can see it's so close to the vicarage. And then, of course, over here is the cottage where Mr. Redding has been painting. "Thank you very much, Miss Marple. Very kind of you, but I think I won't. Nothing till lunchtime. That's my motto. Now, I want to talk to you about this sad business. Very sad business indeed. It's upset us all, I'm sure. Well, it seems possible that, owing to the position of your house and your garden, you may have been able to tell us something we want to know about yesterday evening." "As a matter of fact, I was in my little garden from 5 o'clock onward yesterday. And of course from there, well, one simply cannot help seeing anything that is going on next door." "Well, I understand, Miss Marple, that Mrs. Prothero passed this way yesterday evening?" "Yes, she did. I called out to her, and she admired my roses." "Could you tell us about what time that was?" "I should say it was just a minute or two after 6:15. Yes, that's right. The church clock had just chimed the quarter." "Very good. What happened next?" "Well, Mrs. Prothero said she was calling for her husband at the vicarage so that they could go home together. She had come along the lane, you understand, and she went into the vicarage by the back gate and across the garden." "She came from the lane?" "Yes, I'll show you." Full of eagerness, Miss Marple led us out into the garden and pointed out the lane that ran along by the bottom of her garden. "The path opposite with the stile leads to the hall," she explained. "That was the way they were going home together. Mrs. Prothero came from the village." Perfectly, said Colonel Melchett. "And she went across to the vicarage, you say?" "Yes, I saw her turn the corner of the house. I suppose the colonel wasn't there yet, because she came back almost immediately and went down the lawn to the studio, that building over there, the one that the vicar lets Mr. Redding use as his studio." "I see. And you didn't happen to hear a shot, Miss Marple?" "I didn't hear a shot then," said Miss Marple. "But you did hear one sometime?" "Yes, I think there was a shot somewhere in the woods, but quite 5 or 10 minutes afterwards, and, as I say, out in the woods. At least I think so. It couldn't have been, but surely it couldn't have been. She stopped, pale with excitement. Yes, we'll come to all that presently, said Colonel Melchett. Please, go on with your story. Mrs. Prothero went down to the studio. Yes, she went inside and waited. Presently Mr. Redding came along the lane from the village. He came to the vicarage gate, looked all around, and— Saw you, Miss Marple? As a matter of fact, he did see me, said Miss Marple, flushing slightly. Because, you see, just at that minute I was bending right over trying to get up one of those nasty dandelions, you know. So difficult. And then he went through the gate and down to the studio. He didn't go near the house? Well, no, he went straight to the studio. Mrs. Prothero came to the door to meet him, and they both went inside. Here Miss Marple contributed a singularly eloquent pause. Perhaps she was sitting for him, I suggested. Perhaps, said Miss Marple. And then they came out when? About 10 minutes later? Was that roughly? Well, the church clock had chimed the half hour. They strolled out through the garden gate and along the lane, and just that minute Dr. Stone came down the path leading to the hall and climbed over the stile and joined them. They all walked toward the village together. At the end of the lane, I think, but I can't be quite sure, they were joined by Miss Cram. I think it must have been Miss Cram, because her skirts were so short. You must have very good eyesight, Miss Marple, if you can observe as far as that. Well, I was observing a bird, said Miss Marple. A golden-crested wren, I think he was, a sweet little fellow. I had my glasses out, and that's how I happened to see Miss Cram, if it was Miss Cram, and I think it was, who joined them. Ah, well, that may be so, said Colonel Melchett. Now, since you seem very good at observing, did you happen to notice, Miss Marple, what sort of expression Mrs. Prothero and Mr. Redding had as they passed along the lane? They were smiling and talking, said Miss Marple. They seemed very happy to be together, if you know what I mean. They didn't seem upset or disturbed in any way. Oh, no, just the opposite. Deuced odd, said the Colonel. There's something deuced odd about this whole thing. Miss Marple suddenly took our breath away by remarking in a placid voice, Has Mrs. Prothero been saying that she committed this crime now? Upon my soul, said the Colonel. How did you come up with that guess, Miss Marple? Well, I rather thought it might happen, said Miss Marple. I think dear Lettice thought so too. She's really a very sharp girl. Not always very scrupulous, I'm afraid. So Anne Prothero says she killed her husband. Well, I don't think that it's true. No, I'm almost sure it isn't true. Not with a woman like Anne Prothero. Although one can never be quite sure about anyone, can one? At least that's what I've found. When does she say she shot him? At 20 minutes past 6, just after speaking to you. Miss Marple shook her head slowly and pityingly. The pity was, I think, for two full-grown men being so foolish as to believe this story. At least, that is what we felt like. What did she shoot him with? A pistol. And where did she find it? Well, she says she brought it with her. Well, that she didn't do, said Miss Marple with unexpected decision. I can swear to it. She'd no such thing with her. You mightn't have seen it. Of course, I should have seen it. Well, if it was in her handbag, perhaps. She wasn't carrying a handbag. Well, it might have been concealed upon her person. Miss Marple directed a glance of sorrow and scorn upon him. My dear Colonel Melchett, you know what young women are nowadays, not ashamed to show exactly how the Creator made them, and she hadn't so much as a handkerchief in the top of her stocking. Melchett was obstinate. You must admit that it all fits in, he said. The time, the overturned clock pointing to 6:22. Miss Marple turned on me. Do you mean you haven't told him about your clock yet? What about the clock, Clement? I told him, and he showed a good deal of annoyance. Why on earth didn't you tell Slack about this last night? Because, he said, he wouldn't let me. Nonsense, you ought to have insisted. Probably, I said. Inspector Slack behaves quite differently to you than he does to me. I had no earthly chance of insisting. It's an extraordinary business altogether, said Melchett. If a third person comes along and claims to have done this murder, I shall go to a lunatic asylum. If I might be allowed to suggest, murmured Miss Marple. Well, if you were to tell Mr. Redding what Mrs. Prothero has done, and then explain that you don't really believe it's her, and then if you were to go to Mrs. Prothero and tell her that Mr. Redding is all right, why then, they might each of them tell you the truth. And the truth is helpful, though I dare say they don't know very much of it themselves, poor things. It's all very well, but they are the only two people who had a motive for making away with Prothero. Oh, I wouldn't say that, Colonel Melchett, said Miss Marple. Why? Can you think of anyone else? Oh, yes, indeed. Why, she counted on her fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yes, and a possible 7. I can think of at least 7 people who would be very glad to have Colonel Prothero out of the way. The colonel looked at her feebly. 7 people? In St. Mary Mead? 7 people. Miss Marple nodded brightly. Mind you, I name no names, she said. That wouldn't be right, but I'm afraid there's a lot of wickedness in the world. A nice, honorable, upright soldier like you doesn't know about these things, Colonel Melchett. I thought the chief constable was going to have an apoplexy. And that's where we'll stop today. Have a great day, guys.